Welcome to Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Civil War with our special guest speaker, Chuck Mills. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the Arlington 55 Plus YouTube channel when time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that only he appears in the recording. You are viewing this program through the Virtual Center for Active Adults VCAA platform, a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions to provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities. We have people viewing the Zoom from several local jurisdictions outside of Arlington, from home and in person at our Run Community Center as well. Many thanks to Nicole Waller for all she does to provide these virtual programs through the VCA platform. Thank you to Nick England, Arlington County 55 Plus Operations Supervisor and Tech Expert, for making it possible for our participants to view this program from Level Run. And also many, many thanks. Even though Sheila had gave me this great introduction, she deserves all the thanks when it comes down to creating this program. This is Sheila's program. She's one of our phenomenal programmers, outstanding virtual programmers, just a great person overall. Thank you, Sheila. I am honored and delighted to introduce author and historian Chuck Mills. Chuck has spoken with us before about his latest book entitled Virginia Legends and Lore. He has written many books on some very fascinating historical topics that were so intriguing we had to ask him back. Chuck has a passion for history. He has roamed the world researching historical topics and is delighted to have lived most of his life in Northern Virginia, one of the most historic regions in the country. He now lives in the banks of the Potomac River near Mount Vernon on land once owned by George Washington. Chuck is a graduate of Penn State University and has advanced degrees from Penn State, GW, George Mason University. He retired after a career with the Department of Navy. Following his retirement, he became a realtor with Weichert Realtors in Alexandria. Chuck is on the board of the Prince William Historic Preservation Foundation, a member of the Fairfax County Cemetery Preservation Society, a former board member of the Manassas Museum, and he's also a docent at the Carlisle House in Alexandria. Chuck is also the producer and co-host of Virginia Time Travel, a monthly history television show that airs to some 2 million viewers in Northern Virginia. It can be found on Cox Cable. Chuck co-hosts the show with his son, Andrew, who teaches at Bishop O'Connell High School in Arlington. When not doing genealogical or historical research, Chuck can be found kayaking on the Potomac River. Thank you, Chuck. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chuck. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Let me start by reading you from the reminiscences of Nanny Neville Leachman, who lived in Manassas at the time of the Civil War. And she writes, every summer when the hardest farm work was over, the farmers would relax a little and have a series of dances and parties. And one that was especially enjoyed was a tournament and an all-day picnic in the woods where a platform was laid for dancing. Now, weeks before this event, all the boys who had horses that could run would start practicing for a joust. And a post would be set up in a field, and there would be a bent arm on which hung a ring. And the boys would charge this with lances and try to get the ring off of this post. And the boy who took the most rings at the end of the day became the head knight, and his girl would become the queen, and so on down the line. Now, the boys wore brightly colored sashes across their white shirts and a streamers would come out behind them, and they looked very attractive to the young women. And the girls wore ribbons of the same colors as their knights and waved these colors as their specials went by. And after the judges decided which were the victors, they chose their ladies and ascended a rustic throne. And the queen was crowned to much applause. And Nanny Neville Leachman wrote, "I'll never forget his closing words. I crown thee the queen of love and beauty." Well, thus began many a youthful love in 1861. In 1861, 31 million people lived in the United States, 27 million whites and 4 million enslaved people. New York City had a population of 1 million, and Philadelphia 565,000. Our own Washington had 75,000 people. The state of California boasted 380,000. New Orleans, the largest city in the South, had a population of 172,000. Charleston, 48,000, and Richmond, 40,000. In the North, cities were growing and industries prospering. In the South, cotton was king, and the people followed the agricultural traditions of their forefathers. Now, the two regions developed somewhat differently with regard to courtship. It was urbanization that made the difference. In rural areas, premarital sex among the betrothed was traditionally tolerated because young women could depend on family, neighbors, and church authorities to compel young men to marry them in case of pregnancy. In large cities with highly mobile populations, policing was much more difficult. Attempts were made, however. Massachusetts passed a law encouraging women to name the father of an illegitimate child by immunizing the woman from prosecution for the crime of fornication. This was done in order to force the father to contribute to the maintenance of the child, which would otherwise be chargeable to the town. Breach of promise suits were also popular. A breach of promise suit was brought by a woman whose lovers promised marriage, indulged in sensual activity, and then reneged. Courts usually awarded damages unless it could be proven that the woman had sought or enjoyed the activity. Well, more potent than law was the emergence of a new ideology that promoted male restraint and female purity. The new ideology urged men to avoid all sexual stimulation before marriage and to practice great restraint within marriage. Men were warned that excessive sexual indulgence destroyed a man's physical and mental powers. Advice literature wasn't confined to men. Some advice literature argued that women were inherently chaste and pure. Women were expected to be the moral guardians of the home, stemming the lustful natures of men. Although not a universal opinion, the passionless female became a dominant ideal in the North. This was less true in the South, which, while valuing female chastity, did not deny female sexual desire nor promote the ideal of the passionless woman. Women were, in fact, considered more prone to moral weakness than men because of their emotional natures. The qualities of self-control promoted in the North never became ideals in the rural South. In the South, young men were expected to engage in sexual affairs before marriage. Male virginity aroused suspicion and ridicule. Of course, young men in both regions could always preserve their girlfriend's virtue by relieving their sexual urges with less virtuous women. One set of women represented the ideals of romantic love, and others offered energetic sex. Well, in the North, the role of bad girl was most often filled by immigrants pouring into northern cities and working in factories or as servants. In the South, Black women played the role. Many Southern parents traced the moral ruin of their sons to temptations found in female slaves in their own or neighbors' households. One slaveholder advised white families to use elderly servants only and to put all young slaves to work in the fields. Although accused as sources of temptation, sex was often forced on enslaved women. All Black women were wenches by definition, and therefore sexual prey. If a white male assaulted a slave, the woman's owner might charge the man with assault and battery, but the woman had no legal recourse. Well, women were judged by a different standard than men entirely. Daughters of the prosperous strove to be physically attractive, but not overtly sexual. Adolescent female virgins must be preserved from the corruption that encountering boys, who, as one advisor put it, were not only rude in speech and manners, but of immoral dispositions and habits. Protecting girls from these evils reinforced a new emphasis on female delicacy. This emphasis on delicacy became appalling. Idleness developed into a kind of disease and undermined both physical and nervous health. It must have also been frightfully boring, at least according to Sarah Grinke of Charleston, who observed, where any mental superiority exists, a woman is generally shunned and regarded as stepping outside of her sphere, which is to dress, to dance, to set out to the best possible advantage her person, and to read novels. Now I'd like to read to you from a letter of the time. Sir, the attentions which you have so long and so assiduously shown to me have not escaped my notice. Indeed, how could they, since they were directed exclusively to me? Judge then what must have been my feelings on reading the contents of your letter, in which you propose to pay your addresses in a manner the object of which cannot be mistaken. On consulting my parents, I find that they do not object to your proposal. Therefore, I have only this to add. May we still entertain the same regard which we have hitherto cherished for each other until it shall ripen into that affection which wedlock shall sanction and which lapse of time will not allow to fade. Well, it was with letters like this that couples moved from courtship into formal betrothal. Betrothal in the past had been announced in churches, but by the 1860s, couples had begun announcing their engagements in local newspapers and by writing letters to family and friends. Women also wore engagement rings, a tradition that had started in the 1840s. Now, while love and affection counted for much in tying the marriage knot, wary parents still considered a suitor's ability to support their daughter. Now, this was especially important since a married woman was both legally and financially dependent on her husband. Women usually married in their late teens or early 20s, and men were usually at least 8 years older, as befitted their role as good providers. Well, not everyone looked on impending marriages with a cheerful eye. In 1826, Francis Wright's utopian community in Nashaba, Tennessee, rejected the concept of marriage entirely. Wright and her followers argue that love and respect rather than legal tie should bind couples. When love and respect disappeared, couples should simply separate. In New York, the Oneida community, founded in 1848, described marriage as contrary to natural liberty, a cruel and oppressive method of uniting the sexes. This community practiced a form of community marriage, where each woman was married to every man and each man to every woman. Now, most Americans rejected these views and pressured young people to marry. A man's credit rating, in fact, depended in part on whether or not he was married and had children. Weddings of the period grew more elaborate. Nuptials had traditionally been performed in family parlors and had frequently been civil ceremonies presided over by a local judge or justice of the peace. But the Civil War era found more couples being married in churches, at least partly to accommodate larger audiences. Now, following the ceremony came the honeymoon. Nearby cities and spas were popular destinations for country folk. Growing numbers headed for New York City and Niagara Falls. Friends and relatives often accompany newlyweds on their travels. And in other instances, couples selected destinations or planned routes so they could visit with relatives. Now, there was a great deal of advice directed at the newly married, especially women. A Charleston newspaper advised that when a woman married, she should give up her heart, feelings, fancies, and opinions to her husband. Another advice giver counseled that only submission could make marriage work. Watch well the first moments when your will conflicts with his to whom God and society have given the control. The gentle and submissive Victorian wife was sexually inhibited. Her repressed upbringing, the spirituality forced upon her, and her ignorance of physiology all combined to make her nervous and skittish. While many women acknowledged experiencing sexual desire, they also expressed feelings of guilt and confusion about their sexual lives. For the most part, they thought that sexual relations should be confined to marriage, and the vast majority believed that reproduction was the primary aim of sexual activity. Most women tried to follow this Victorian norm and felt guilty when they failed to live up to the ideal. Some advice manuals assured women that frigidity was a virtue to be cultivated and a condition to be desired, while other manuals indicated that sex must be cherished as one of life's few legitimate pleasures. Now, slavery, the South's so-called peculiar institution, violated traditional African marriage patterns, which resembled practices of pre-industrial cultures. Acceptance of premarital sex among the young, high fertility rates, and common law marriages. Slave marriages were not recognized in the state codes. No state legislature ever considered encroaching upon a master's property rights by legalizing slave marriages. Marriage was voluntary on the part of the enslaved and permissive on the part of the master. Slave marriages were regulated by whatever laws the owner saw fit to enforce. Now, ordinarily, enslaved people picked their own mates, but were required to ask the master for permission to marry. Most owners refused to allow slaves to marry away from home. Men who married away from home were frequently absent and thus exposed to temptations. Having obtained the master's consent, the couple might begin living together without further formality, or their masters might pronounce vows. Ceremonies conducted by slave preachers or white clergymen were not uncommon even for field hands and were customary for the domestic servants. No slave marriage, however, was ever safe from the caprice of the master, who could end the marriage by selling one or both of the partners. Thus, a slave preacher in Kentucky united couples in wedlock until death or distance do you part. Many husbands felt that they were doing their wives a favor by taking their animal instincts elsewhere. Men of all ages, married and unmarried, from city lawyers to visiting country storekeepers to sailors, turned to brothels for sexual release. These brothels ranged in quality and general excellence from the parlor houses situated not far from the city's best hotels through more numerous and moderately priced houses that drew artisans and clerks, right down to the dockside grog shops that catered to sailors. Prostitutes known as Cyprians, fallen angels, the daughters of Eve and daughters of Joy were numerous. New York City had 20,000 prostitutes. Cincinnati had some 7,000 in a population of 200,000. Philadelphia had 12,000 prostitutes in a population of 700,000. The number of prostitutes in Philadelphia was relatively low because of the nearness of Atlantic City, of which it was said, Paris may be subtler, London may be grosser in its vices, but for largeness of depravity, for domineering insolence of sin, for rowdy callousness to censure, Atlantic City finds no rival on earth. From New Orleans to Boston, city theaters were important sexual marketplaces. Men bought tickets less to see the performance than to make assignations with the prostitutes, who sat by custom in the topmost gallery of seats. The women received free admission from theater managers who drew patrons by their presence. With the outbreak of war, Many of the daughters of Eve followed the drum, attaching themselves to the armies as cooks and laundresses. The mob of camp followers attached to the Army of the Potomac in 1862 was dubbed Hooker's Army in honor of the commanding general, Joseph Hooker. The term hooker has come down to modern times as a description of a woman of easy virtue. Washington saw an explosion of active and prosperous bawdy houses. Before the outbreak of war, Washington had some 500 prostitutes. As Washington became the bustling hub of the Union Army in the East, ambitious girls from New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, and St. Louis converged on Washington. There were 450 known houses in Washington in 1862, employing 5,000 women, with an additional 2,500 women employed in nearby Georgetown and Alexandria. Bordellos occupied whole blocks along the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue. The Army christened these establishments the Post Office, Fort Sumter, the Wolf's Den, the Haystack, and the Cottage by the Sea. In the expensive houses, there were luxurious furnishings and pretty young hostesses dressed in silk. Now, these establishments were not popular with the neighbors. Tired of loud late night parties and the general atmosphere of carousing, residents of one neighborhood threatened to make up a list of officers who frequented notorious places of infamy and report them to the commanding general and to their families at home. The press also took a hand in censoring the sinful atmosphere, condemning the uniformed idlers who go gallanting the painted Jezebels with which the city is stocked. Well, the provost marshal made some effort to suppress the trade. Brothels were raided by the provost marshal and, after a fine, declared broken up. For a girl, the fine was $5 or 3 months in the House of Corrections. For a madam, the fine was $50 or 6 months in the House of Corrections. Well, as a practical matter, the fines were paid. No one spent any time in the House of Corrections, and the sporting house merely set up shop at a new location. The provost marshal did have some success, however. The employment of pretty waiter girls in beer and concert saloons was prohibited, and these well-known places of assignation were quickly cleaned up. Now, although the provost marshal's efforts were considered to be somewhat of a joke by many, there was a sound military reason for cracking down on the trade. Union military records reveal that 82 out of every 1,000 men, some 8% of the Army, suffered from some sort of debilitating venereal disease. Washington did not have a monopoly on vice. In Richmond, proper citizens complained of active bawdy houses. Go to the Capitol Square any afternoon, and you may see these women promenading up and down the shady walks, jostling respectable women into the gutters. Of Memphis, Tennessee, during the Union occupation, it was said, virtue is scarcely known within the limits of the city. Are there any questions to this point? Okay, if not, let's turn back to the married. Advice to prospective parents: caution that couples should bottle up sexual passion prior to marriage and to a large extent during marriage in order to release them in a volcanic baby begetting session. Other things being equal, parents were told, the more powerful this function and intense its action at the time it stamps the impress of life and character on its products, the more highly endowed such products. The first child was usually born within 18 months of the wedding. Few mothers gave birth in hospitals. Public hospitals did not exist, and those who could afford private hospitals preferred the security of home. Childbirth was regarded as a natural process requiring no special medical environment or equipment. It was, however, a potentially dangerous undertaking. Infant mortality in Massachusetts, for example, hovered around 15% compared to 1.5% today. Nationwide, pregnancy-related causes accounted for more than 5% of all adult female deaths. The average woman bore 8 children. 1 out of every 6 of these children died before the age of 1. An additional 10% died between the ages of 1 and 21. A baby born in the Civil War era had an 80% chance of living to become an adult. Of course, war made things even more difficult. For example, on July the 18th, 1861, the Lewis family of the 769-acre Portici farm near Manassas, Virginia, suddenly found themselves swept up in the fury of war. Skirmishing began at nearby Blackbird's Ford. On July the 21st, the Lewis family was notified by Confederate officers that a battle was imminent and that their house would probably be in the thick of the fight. The family evacuated. They took everything they could, but left valuable and heavy furniture behind. This was stored in a small room in an angle of the house, and the room was securely nailed shut. Ironically, the only shot that struck the house during the battle struck this room and destroyed all the furniture. But furniture was a trifling matter. Fanny was in her 9th month of pregnancy and went into labor as the family began to evacuate the house. Servants found a nearby ravine and dug a small earthen room into the bank. They covered it over with greens. It was here that Fanny Lewis delivered her first baby, John Beauregard Lewis. To spare the wife the physical strain of pregnancy, or spare the family the financial burden of another child, couples often look for ways of preventing pregnancy. Because of the delicate nature of the subject, even educated people often knew nothing about contraception. The first works on contraception published in the United States were Moral Physiology in 1831 and The Fruits of Philosophy in 1832. Both of these works described a full range of contraceptive techniques while rejecting the idea of intervening in the natural sex act. Official opinion, both legal and religious, was deeply hostile to contraception. Despite official disapproval, by 1839, each book had gone through 9 editions, placing some 30,000 books in circulation. Contraceptive devices were rudimentary. Home remedies, such as engaging in vigorous dancing and horseback riding after intercourse, were popular. The discovery of vulcanization in 1843 led to the manufacture of a crude, heavy type of condom that was used with increasing frequency. One wag described these early condoms as a breastplate against pleasure and a cobweb against danger. Now let's look at some family problems. Authority over the family was legally vested in men, which profoundly influenced a woman's ability to control property, dissolve her marriage, or ensure custody of her children. There were fewer than 10,000 divorces a year in 1861. A woman's right to own property emerged slowly. Mississippi passed the first Married Woman's Property Act in 1839. In 1845, Massachusetts passed similar legislation, with New York following in 1848. In 1855, Massachusetts, far in advance of the rest of the Union, legislated to protect the wages of working married women, which were at the time the legal property of her husband. Laws concerning divorce varied widely among the states throughout much of American history. In New England, where the Puritans had defined marriage as a civil contract rather than as a religious sacrament, secular law had provided for divorce as early as the 17th century. Like any other contract, the marriage bond could be broken when either of the contracting parties failed to meet the obligations it imposed. Adultery, impotence, desertion, or convictions of serious crimes were all grounds for divorce. Additionally, wives could obtain a divorce on the grounds of non-support. In most states in the early 19th century, however, an act of the legislature was required to end marriage. As the century progressed, divorce laws became more liberal. During the 1850s, Indiana was widely condemned for its liberal ways. A couple in Indiana could obtain a divorce on any grounds that a judge ruled proper. Indiana judges were far more permissive than the New York City judge, who in 1861 refused to grant a divorce to a wife whose husband had beaten her unconscious in an argument over letting the family dog sleep on the bed. The judge advised the woman that 1 or 2 acts of cruel treatment were not proper grounds for divorce. Indiana's liberal stance on divorce attracted a flood of applicants from other states. The influential newspaper editor and future presidential nominee, Horace Greeley, denounced Indiana as the paradise of free lovers, whose example would soon lead to a general profligacy and corruption such as this country has never known. Among the enslaved population, divorce, like marriage, was within the master's jurisdiction. Rules were as severe or as lax as the master wished. The sexual family problems arising from the institution of slavery were many and varied, but all stemmed from the tremendous imbalance of power between master and slave. Every slave child became the master's property. Thus, it was in the master's best interest to give great care to pregnant slave women and their offspring. Every infant was worth $200 the moment it was born, compared to $1,200 for a robust field hand. In Mississippi, there's a record of a small planter who succeeded very well in raising young slaves, although otherwise unsuccessful as a traditional farmer. Some slave children were earmarked for special purposes. In one instance, $1,600 and $1,700 were paid for two young enslaved women to be used as fancy girls in bordellos in New Orleans. The power of the master over the slave was arbitrary and almost completely unchecked. The very existence of slave families facilitated control. Masters could threaten to sell children or spouses. Family bonds also discouraged slaves from running away and leaving their loved ones behind. But there are other aspects to be considered. Bloom's Hill Plantation in Virginia was owned by the Cockrells. This farm had a reputation for treating slaves well. Cockrell bought a 16-year-old girl from a nearby plantation and brought her to Bloom's Hill to cook. The girl had 4 children by Cockrell. Such liaisons were common. According to the census of 1860, more than 500,000 slaves, some 12% of the total enslaved population, were mixed blood. Most, but not all, miscegenation involved white males and female slaves. The white female, who was known to have lived with a black man, was driven from society, but the white male paid no such price. The white male risked domestic chilliness from an angry wife, but it was the slave woman who was apt to feel the full fury of these pent-up jealousies. Freedom was the greatest gift a master could bestow. The situation of the free black, however, was only slightly better than that of the slave. Free blacks could not vote, or were required to register every 3 years, and had to buy certificates of freedom. Free blacks could not marry slaves. Free blacks were feared and mistrusted. They were accused of being unwilling to work, of spreading discontent among slaves, and of causing a disproportionate amount of crime. Despite these restrictions, many free blacks managed to improve their lot. And now let's look at some famous Civil War couples, such as the Lincolns. In the fall of 1839, 20-year-old Mary Todd moved from Lexington, Kentucky to Springfield, Illinois. Shortly after her arrival, she met 30-year-old Abraham Lincoln and a cotillion. Lincoln came up to her and said in his suavest manner, "Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." The next evening, Lincoln called on her again and began his courtship. Over the next few years, Mary became engaged to Lincoln, broke up with him, entered a period of separation and misunderstanding, and finally began seeing him again. On the morning of November the 3rd, 1842, Lincoln dropped by the home of Reverend Charles Dresser. The Dresser family was at breakfast and Lincoln announced, "I want to get hitched tonight." Reverend Dresser agreed to the arrangement, and everything was set until after leaving the Dresser home, Lincoln happened to meet Ninian Edwards in the street. He told Mr. Edwards of his plan for the marriage that night, but Mr. Edwards replied, "No, I'm Mary's guardian, and if she is married at all, it must be from my house." When Elizabeth Edwards was informed of the plan, it was decided that the marriage would be delayed by one day as the Episcopal Sewing Society was meeting at the Edwards home that night and dinner had already been ordered. Well, sometime before the wedding, Lincoln visited Chatterton's jewelry shop in Springfield. He ordered a gold wedding ring and had it inscribed, "Love is eternal." Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married at the Edwards home on Friday evening, November the 4th, 1842. Some 30 relatives and friends attended this ceremony. Mary wore a white muslin dress. She wore neither a veil nor flowers in her hair. A week after the marriage, on November the 11th, 1842, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a friend. Most of the letter dealt with legal matters, but he closed the letter with the following sentence: "Nothing new here except my marrying, which to me is a matter of profound wonder." The Stuarts. In 1855, J.E.B. Stuart, who would go on to become a dashing Confederate cavalry officer, met Flora Cook, the daughter of the commander of the 2nd U.S. Dragoon Regiment. They became engaged in September, less than 2 months after meeting. Stuart humorously wrote of his rapid courtship in Latin, what many men both before and after have thought: "Veni, vidi, evictus sum." I came, I saw, I was conquered. And so, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I can.
Hi, I have sort of a question and a comment. Maybe you could on two things. So one is, I thought it was very interesting when you were talking about the slave marriages. And of all, to me, it seems of all the purest marriages was in fact the slave marriages, because it was a choice that they chose themselves. Since they were owned by somebody else, since they had no control over their own lives, it seemed the fact that they had their own marriages amongst themselves seemed to me a sort of a very pure love or commitment and liking.
Now, I think that's a very good observation. I mean, because marriages among the wealthier folks definitely had an eye on property and a provider and everything else. No, I think that's a very, very good observation.
Yes, I thought that was really interesting, and I will have to sort of look in on that myself. I had one other one. I guess I always end up with this question whenever we talk about prostitution and the number of people traveling. And I've listened to immigration talks and the notion of prostitution. Mr. Mills, no one ever really. I guess I'm always on the defensive about women and their need to prostitute themselves. And for me, it's a living to feed their children, to feed themselves, because there are no other real options. You did not talk about that, but because there were so many camp followers, I know some of them were wives, but a lot of people were left with just farms and no spouses to run those farms. a lot of people, if they didn't come from families that could support them, where there was money left, where a daughter could stay or live with her brother's family. I would like you to talk more about the fact that, because it seems, I don't want people ever to get this impression that women said, oh, yippee, let me choose prostitution, let me become a champ follower. And I wish you would talk more about their circumstances which led them into this. Please.
Oh, yeah, that's another very good observation. I mean, women didn't have any career paths open to them at the time, and there were very few things they could do. Actually, the war opened up some opportunities. For example, at the Treasury Department, women were hired. They used to run off the greenbacks, the dollar bills, and they would have to cut them by hand with scissors. And so they hired women to do that. But by and large, women did not have any career opportunities. And as you say, if their husband was killed in the war,
yeah.
In England, for example, there were a large number of streetwalkers in London, and it was very dire. People actually had to sleep standing up, and they would put ropes across like herds of women. I mean, 40 or 50 people packed together, standing up because of this rope, and they would sleep standing up against the wall. So yes, the financial condition of women, especially in urban areas, was very dire.
Yeah. I appreciate you speaking about that when you do talk about them, that there's a reason for it and it's not just a selection. So thank you very much. That was very interesting, Mr. Mills.
Well, thank you.
Okay, do anybody have any more questions for Mr. Mills? All right, well, thank you all again for joining us for today's program, and you all have a good one. Thank you, Chuck.